In this video, we're going to cover Dreamcast emulation on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. Emulating the Dreamcast on Xbox Series X and S is awesome. It runs really great, you're able to get a lot of features out of it, and just enjoy the Dreamcast library in a very pleasing way. On top of that, the Xbox Series X and S are powerful enough to up-res the game so you can enjoy them in higher fidelity. So in this guide, I'm going to take you through Dreamcast emulation setup through the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. A standalone version of Flycast is also available. Both options are awesome, but if you'd like to keep everything contained within Retroarch, this is the video for you. Let's go ahead and dive in. Now, as we get started, there's a couple of things you're going to need to do first. The first of which, getting your Xbox registered for dev mode and getting the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch installed. So in the description below, you will find a link to my Xbox dev mode and Retroarch emulation setup guide if you have not done this already. Guide goes over how to get registered for dev mode, get a properly formatted USB drive, and getting Retroarch installed. So do this first, then you can come back and continue along with this guide. Now go ahead and get your Xbox booted up into dev mode. Again, make sure you have Retroarch set up and everything good to go, running to your USB drive. Make sure your USB drive is plugged in. From here, load up Retroarch. Now head down to the online updater, core downloader, and now just press right on your D-pad until you get down to the Sega section here, and then just press A on the Sega Dreamcast / Naomi Flycast core to get it downloaded. You don't already have it downloaded. And if you do already have it downloaded, this just updates it to the latest version. With the core downloaded, go ahead and quit out of Retroarch. Now we're going to take that USB drive out of our Xbox and move it over to a PC. Once you have your Xbox USB drive brought up on your computer, we're going to go ahead and add in the Dreamcast BIOS to our Retroarch system folder. If you happen to still own a physical Dreamcast and it can read burned discs, you can download Dreamshell and use a serial port adapter to easily get a Dreamcast BIOS as well as dump any Dreamcast games that you'd like. The link to this guide will be in the description below for anyone interested. Otherwise, you are going to need to resort to Google and find a BIOS file for yourself. There are no illegal download links provided on this channel. But once you have your Dreamcast BIOS file, it needs to be named dc_boot.bin. And to get it to work with Retroarch, we're just going to head into our Retroarch folder, system folder. We're going to create a new folder in here and name it DC, just lowercase like so. Going to open that up and drag the dcboot.bin inside, and that is now good to go. And now we're going to go ahead and prep our Dreamcast games for use with Retroarch as well. So again, if you have a large physical collection of Dreamcast games and an original Dreamcast that could read burned discs, you can use Dreamshell to dump those to a serial port adapter to easily get access to them. Otherwise, once again, Google will be your friend. Don't ask me for illegal download links. But Dreamcast games can be in a couple of different formats. CDI, these are compressed Dreamcast game rips, so the audio quality may be degraded, video quality and cutscenes may be degraded, but at the same time, a lot of homebrew will use this format. The proper format for Dreamcast retail games will be in GDI format, so it'll have a GDI track with a lot of subtracks. But if you don't like the way that works, you can actually convert those into CHUD format, and I will have a link to the script to use that in the comment section below. So as you can see, I have all of my Dreamcast games in CHUD format. Now for multi-disc games, we're going to have to do a bit more setup by creating an M3U file. So I'm going to show you how to create an M3U file real quick here. So you're just going to create a new text document and then just name it after the game. Now open up that text document. And we're going to put the name of both of our discs into the text document with extensions. So if you're using CHUD format or CDI format, you're just going to copy the whole file plus extension in. And for GDI format games, you're going to copy in the GDI file. So one disc per line. Just like so, and then just go ahead and save it, and then you can close out. And now we're just going to rename the extension from txt to .m3u. So if you can't see the .txt extension, make sure that you have show file name extensions enabled in Windows. And when it gets angry at you, just click on yes, and there we go. That is now ready to go for Retroarch. So just go through and do the same exact process for all of your other games. I already have them, but you can see just one disc per line. Like so. And once you have your games good to go, just add them anywhere on your Xbox's USB drive. So if you use the media creation tool, you have a subfolder ready to go for Sega Dreamcast, and you can just put them all there. Otherwise, just put them wherever the frick you want. Doesn't matter. And with your games and BIOS placed, we could go ahead and close out of everything on the computer and move our drive over to the Xbox to begin playing some Dreamcast. So back over on the Xbox, once it detects your USB drive, go ahead and load back up into Retroarch. Now from here, we can begin loading games one of two ways. We could go into the load content button, go to our E drive, find our Dreamcast games, select a game, choose our Flycast core, and it will boot up and run. I personally find this a bit too long-winded for my taste, so I like to go down to import content, go down to manual scan, navigate to that Dreamcast games folder, tell it to scan this directory. Now for system name, scroll down until you find Sega Dreamcast. And then we'll choose our default core for Flycast. So again, just navigate down to the Sega section, find Dreamcast Flycast. Now, if you have subfolders with your multi-disc games, we're going to go ahead and turn recursive scan off, so that way it'll only find the Dreamcast games that are a single file. And it is also worth noting, if you're using GDI files, you'll want to come up here to File Extensions and type in GDI. Otherwise, it'll pick up all the subfiles as well, and you'll have multiple entries for your games. But with all of these options set, we're going to go ahead and start the scan. Once that scan's completed, we're going to go ahead and do it again for our multi-disc games. So we're going to turn scan recursively on this time. And for file extensions, we're going to type in M3U. And once that's set, we're going to go ahead and start the scan again. Now when we back out and head over to the left bar over here, we'll have all of our Dreamcast games available to select from our playlist. And you'll see that your multi-disc games are included in this. So there's Code Veronica, Resident Evil 2, and Shenmue. But to play a game, all you need to do is press A on it and tell it to run. So if you had your Dreamcast BIOS in place, you'll get the Dreamcast boot animation. And then you can begin enjoying your Dreamcast games. So again, Dreamcast works really well on the Xbox Series X and S, looks really good. Xbox controllers are a one-to-one map for Dreamcast games, so there's going to be no confusion on that regard. So just a really great experience overall. Now let's talk about changing discs in multi-disc games. Process for this is really simple. If you made those M3U files, you're just going to go into your Retroarch quick menu. Now we're going to make sure there is one option set specifically for Dreamcast here. So we're going to press B, go down to settings, user interface, and make sure pause content when menu is active is turned off. If it is turned on, disk swaps don't always work reliably. Now in our quick menu, scroll down until you find disk control, eject your current disk, but go ahead and click on current disk index and it will have all of the contents of that M3U file you created just present here for you to select. So we're going to select Shenmue Disk 1. And then we're going to tell it to insert the disk. And then we could just go ahead and launch the game through our Dreamcast BIOS. And now we could start up a game, and there we go. But now let's go over available controller types real quick. So once again, going back into the Retroarch quick menu, if you head down to the Controls tab, Port 1 Controls, under device type, you can see that there are a number of options available. So you have your standard controller, arcade sticks, twin sticks, Saturn twin sticks, maracas, fishing controller, racing controllers, all sorts of things. Now, unfortunately, mouse support still doesn't seem to work within the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch, so we can't really take advantage of that. But If you have an arcade stick that you want to map for Dreamcast games as an arcade stick, that's available, and then just being able to remap specific controllers to your controller. And of course, if you ever change any controls and wish to save them per game, head up to Manage Remap Files, and then you can save the remap file. But with that, you now have all the basics required to enjoy Dreamcast games on your Xbox Series X and S. So from this point on in the video, we're going to be going over the available core options and extras. Let's dive in now. Heading back into the Retroarch quick menu, head down to core options. And our first set of options are in the system menu. So our first available option is to choose our region. So you can choose between Japan, USA, Europe. Choose the one that you need for your available region if it isn't already set. Next, we could change language between Japanese, English, German, French, Spanish, Italian, or default. So again, choose your language. Next, we have the HLE BIOS. So if you did not want to include a Dreamcast BIOS in your setup, you could just enable this option and you can run Flycast without a Dreamcast BIOS. Next, boot to BIOS. So if you want to load up a game and go straight to the Dreamcast BIOS, you could just turn this option on. It'll boot into the Dreamcast BIOS where you can manage saves and things like that. Next up, enable DSP. This is audio, so you want to leave that on. And next, we have broadband adapter emulation. Not very many games make use of the broadband adapter, so you're honestly better off just leaving this option off if you want to play games online through Flycast and Retroarch. The broadband adapter also requires more setup, whereas the built-in dial-up modem emulation is pretty much good to go right off the bat. So just quick example of that with Phantasy Star Online here, you do need to have an account on the Silverant private servers for this to work, but you could just easily log right in. Then just select online mode and go through all these processes. But as you can see, information is already provided for Flycast for you to connect with. And there we go. We are now online with Phantasy Star Online on Flycast on the Xbox Series S. So again, most things should work pretty automatically just like this, but for Phantasy Star Online, you do need to make an account on Silverant before you can connect to the private server. Other games don't require this. If you're interested in seeing further steps you need per game, you could also head to the Dreamcast Live site and go to their connection guide and see a list of all the online Dreamcast games, and you could click on any specific one in order to see what you need to do. So again, you can choose to enable broadband adapter emulation if you want, but again, just a bit more complicated to get set up, and far fewer Dreamcast games will actually make use of it, so easier and more compatible just to leave this one off. And the last option on this tab, enable UPnP, just go ahead and leave this one on. But moving on, next tab, video. So first option, internal resolution. This is where we can finally up-res our games. So there are numerous options available, so you can push this all the way up to full 4K and beyond if desired. But the common rule of thumb when it comes to up-resing your games, if you find that you are getting performance issues where you didn't have them before, just lower it back down until you get full speed returned. So for today's demo, I'm just going to go with 1440 as my internal resolution here. And changes take place in real time, which is really nice. We don't have to restart the core for this to happen, so you can really fine-tune the internal resolution to work best on your systems and games. Next up, cable type. This is set to TV composite. Just go ahead and leave it here. This is the most compatible option, but there is rare occasions where you will need to set this over to RGB, with Unreal Tournament being one specific example to point to. You will need to set that one over to RGB for it to work. Next up, broadcast standard. You can set this between NTSC and PAL, so just choose whatever you need for your games. Next up, screen orientation. So if you are playing a game that will let you rotate your screen, you can set that option here. Next up, alpha sorting. This is set to per triangle, and this option is a good balance between accuracy and performance. If you want the best accuracy, you could change this over to per pixel. It could potentially introduce some slowdown in some games, but for the most part, that shouldn't be too big of a deal, so go ahead and give it a shot. If you're experiencing slowdowns where you didn't have them before, just change it back to triangle. Next up, accumulation pixel buffer size, it's set to 512 megabytes by default. If you are planning on upresing your games, you may need to increase this to make it so they display correctly. I typically set this to 2 gigs on my emulation setups, and I've never really encountered any issues in the games I play. I don't play the most games on Dreamcast though, so try it for yourself and see what works best. Next up, maximum transparent layers. This is set to 32 by default, but you can increase this up to 128. Do note that when you increase the maximum transparent layers, you are going to be increasing the system requirements on your emulation, so it is really just best to leave it at 32 unless you know a specific example that needs it increased and it doesn't impact performance too negatively. Next up, full frame buffer emulation. This is a more accurate way of basically handling Dreamcast games, but it does force you into native resolution when enabled. Do note that it can increase system requirements as well and cause performance issues in some games, so it's really not necessary unless you know a game needs it, especially if you want to upres. Next up, enable RTT, render to texture buffer. This is an option that is automatically enabled on games that need it, so you could just go ahead and leave this one off. Next up, mip mapping, leave this one on. Fog effects, leave it on. Volume modifier, leave it on. Next, anisotropic filtering. This is set to 4 by default, but you can increase it up to 8, 16, drop it down to 2, or turn it off completely as you see fit. Next up, texture filtering. This is set to default, but you could change it to a linear or nearest neighbor upscaling. And this option will require a content restart to apply, so do be aware of that. So it's going to be personal preference which one you like, so just try them all out, see what you think. Next up, delay frame swapping, leave this one on. Next up, detect frame rate changes. So if you are playing a game that is locked to 30 FPS or lower, you could turn this option on to improve the frame timing for those particular games. If the game you're playing is 60 FPS or fluctuates in frame rates, leave this one off. Next up, Power VR2 post-processing filter. If you want to have a more accurate output for your games, you can turn this option on. Next, texture upscaling, XBRZ. You can enable or disable this based on your personal preference on how you like XBRZ texture filtering. Next up, native depth interpolation. As the tooltip says, this helps with texture corruption and depth issues on AMD GPUs, which is what is in use on the Xbox Series X and S. So if you have a game that is having some rendering issues, you could try enabling this and see if it helps out. But otherwise, it's pretty much okay to leave it off for most cases. And next, fix upscale bleeding edge. This is on by default, helps with upresing. But in some 2D games, it can cause issues, so for those specific ones, you might want to turn it off. Next up, performance. Threaded rendering, this is on by default, and you could go ahead and leave it on to help with overall performance of Dreamcast emulation. Then we have auto skip frame and frame skipping. This should not be an issue on Xbox Series X and S, so just go ahead and ignore these. Next up, emulation hacks. First up, widescreen cheats. So you can enable this option and then restart your content. And if a widescreen cheat is found in its internal database, your games will now be patched to run in widescreen. You may still notice the occasional pulling around the 4:3 frame, but as you can see, the aspect ratio is pretty accurately presented. Next up, we have a widescreen hack that basically attempts the same thing, but may or may not be as successful. But if your game doesn't have a built-in cheat with the widescreen cheats version here, you could try the widescreen hack and see if the results are to your liking. Next up, GD-ROM fast loading. This will increase the read speed of the emulated GD-ROM, resulting in faster load times. Could also produce some instabilities in certain titles, so give it a shot. If there's no issues, cool. If there are some, just turn it back off. Next, there's a Dreamcast 32 megabyte RAM mod option where you can enable it so the system will have 32 megabytes of RAM. Probably useful for certain homebrews, but for retail games, just go ahead and leave this one off. Next, we can overclock or underclock the emulated Dreamcast CPU. So if you have games that have variable frame rates, you can increase the speed of your Dreamcast CPU to try to get a more consistent frame rate. Do know that overclocking the emulated CPU does increase system requirements and could cause potential performance problems. So you could give it a shot on games with unlocked frame rates, see if you could get something really good, but if it causes more performance issues, just turn it back down. Next, we have custom textures. So to use custom textures, first thing you're going to do is turn on the custom texture option. Now we're going to go ahead and quit out of Retroarch and move our USB drive over to a computer to get a texture pack installed. With our Xbox USB drive back over on the computer, we're going to go ahead and open up our Retroarch folder here, go to our system folder, the DC folder that we created earlier. And now we're going to create a new folder and name it Textures. And that is now good to go. So let's go ahead and find an HD texture pack to install onto this drive. So we're going to go with a Crazy Taxi HD texture pack here from Chronic Cannabis 88. And they have 3 different sizes available. We're just going to go with their MQ pack here just to not push the system too far, but still give a nice result. So here we go. MQ download link right there. Cool. All right, now that we got that downloaded, just going to get it extracted here with 7-zip. So for Dreamcast HD texture packs, they need to be in a folder with the game code, and then inside will be all the textures. So for this pack in particular, we need to remove this _MQ from the end of it for it to work right on our emulation here. So again, for Crazy Taxi MK-51035. Cool, that is now ready to go, and we can put it into our textures folder we just created. Now, just a reminder, Dreamcast HD texture packs load in on the fly, so you will need to have fast storage for them to work properly. A mechanical hard drive is not going to be fast enough for this experience to work flawlessly. You will need a fast thumb drive or fast external SSD. But with the textures in place for your games, you could go ahead and move back over to your Xbox. But here we are inside a Crazy Taxi with our HD texture pack enabled. As you can see, things are looking a lot more sharp than traditional Crazy Taxi would. And as you can see with the option off, things are not as sharp. And again, by comparison with the pack on, things look like this. So again, HD texture packs are going to be a personal preference deal on whether or not you like the effects that they provide, but there are options available. I'll have a link down to the HD texture pack thread on Reddit for anyone interested. And just as a note, when you're using HD texture packs, having a higher accumulation pixel buffer size will help with the loading and storing of those textures. But our next option is to dump textures, so if you'd like to create your own HD texture packs, you can enable this option, play through a game to dump textures, and then create your own with the files that are dumped. Next up, we have the input tab. So our first option here is analog stick dead zone. This is set to 15% by default, but if you'd like to have more responsive controls, you could change this down to 0 for no dead zone. If your controllers aren't in the greatest of shape and have drift, you can apply a 5% dead zone to compensate for that. Next, trigger dead zones. These are set to 0%. But again, if you have bad triggers, you can increase this a little bit to make it so they don't activate when you don't want them to. Next up, digital triggers. If you want to have your triggers registered more quickly, you can enable digital triggers here, so that way you just get a full 0 to 100 activation. Great for fighting games. And we're going to skip over the rest of these options as they don't really apply to Xbox Series X and S emulation. Next up, controller expansion slots. This is where you can choose what pack is inserted across all of your controller slots. So by default, it is VMU and vibration pack. And then you can adjust this per slot as you see fit, but the default option works just fine. And our last tab is for the visual memory unit. So our first option is to enable per game VMUs, a very useful option considering the VMU has relatively small save space and you can run out of that very quickly. So there's 2 options. You can just have an individual A1 VMU, which is what I prefer, or you can have every VMU that you have enabled have its own per game slot. Next up, VMU sounds. If you want to hear the VMU beeps, enable this option. Next, we can display the VMU screen inside of our emulation. So as you can see, it is up there in the top left corner of my game screen now. Kind of small though, so it's not the easiest to see. So why don't we increase this a little bit with the screen size option here. There we go, that's a bit more usable. You could also change the position if you'd like from the different corners. And then you could change the pixel on and off color to kind of customize the way your VMU will look. Then you could also change the opacity so you can see your game underneath it still. And I love how I glitched out my Crazy Taxi game here by changing my pixel buffer size. It's great stuff. But anyway, you can also adjust these settings for all 4 player VMUs as you see fit. And with that, we've now covered all of the core options available within Flycast. So if there's some options you want to have saved for some games but not others, you can head up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file so that way they only apply to that specific game. But with that, we're going to go ahead and call it for this video. Flycast is again a great way to experience Dreamcast games on the Xbox Series X and S, whether that be through Retroarch or standalone. But thank you so much as always for watching today's tutorial. I hope you have found it informative and it helps you get your Dreamcast emulation project set up nicely on your Xbox Series X and S. Here at the end, just the usual favors to ask. If you haven't already, thumbs up, thumbs down, hit that sub button and notification bell, and if you'd like to further help support the channel to keep these guides coming, be sure to check out that Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen or the join button here on YouTube to help keep us going. Big thank you to all of our current champs. You are incredible. Couldn't do it without you. But until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, keep on gaming, and we'll see you back next video.